With a fatality rate of over 20%, being a crew member aboard a U.S. submarine during World War II was one of the most dangerous jobs in the military. But they were also some of the best fed. They got to enjoy meals like these Swiss steaks and mashed potatoes, which I'm making using the cookbook of the U.S. Navy. So thank you to Babbel for sponsoring this video as we dive into submarine cuisine, this time on Tasting History. Ever since World War II, the submarines of the U.S. Navy have been known for their top-quality grub. So much so that the officers actually eat the same food as the enlisted men. Going back and looking at the menus from several subs during the war, we can see that they ate 3 full meals a day with breakfasts often including fresh fruit, eggs, cereal, bacon, and cinnamon buns. Lunch might be chicken fricassee, lamb with mint sauce, or pork chops with ice cream and a pie to round it off, and then supper of beef stew, meatloaf, salmon salad, fresh corn, and apple pie to finish off the day. Not a bad spread at all, especially when compared with the food that was being served to most of the military at the time. What's really cool is that almost all of the dishes on those menus can be found in this, the Cookbook of the United States Navy. And this is the actual cookbook from 1945. And looking at a midday meal from the USS Ronquil in March of 1945, the men ate Swiss steak and boiled potatoes, both of which are in this book. But instead of the boiled potatoes, because they are just literally boiled potatoes, I'm going to make the mashed potato recipe, but it is one using dehydrated, shredded potatoes, which would have been available later in a submarine's patrol after all the fresh potatoes had run out. But first, let us start with the Swiss steak. Now, these recipes make enough for 100 men, which would have been a good amount for the crew of a submarine, which was usually about 80 men, but is way too much for the crew of Tasting History, which is me. So I am going to cut this recipe way down. So instead of 42 pounds of boneless beef, I'm going to use 3.5 pounds or 1.5 kilograms of boneless beef. Chuck roast is a good cut. Then 2/3 cup or 80 grams of flour, 1 tablespoon of salt, a half teaspoon of pepper, a 1/3 cup or 75 milliliters of cooking oil, 1 pound or 450 grams of canned chopped tomatoes, and a half pound or 225 grams of sliced onions. Then another half teaspoon of salt and another 1/3 cup or 40 grams of flour. The recipe starts by saying to cut the meat into 6-ounce steaks 1 to 1.5 inches thick, and I think mine were about 6 ounces, but they were definitely not uniform. Then you whisk together the flour, salt, and the pepper, and give a generous dusting of that to each steak, coating them front and back and on all the sides, pressing the flour mixture into the meat. Then heat the cooking oil in a heavy skillet over high heat. Frankly, I think that the amount of cooking oil that the recipe calls for is probably too much, at least in my kitchen, so if you want to cut it in like half, that'd be good. However much you use though, once it's very hot, set several of the steaks in and cook them on both sides until they are well browned. Like I said, with this much oil, you really have to be careful of hot, sputtering oil flying everywhere when you flip them, but once they are well browned, it says to place the steaks in a roasting pan and then add the tomatoes over them and cover the whole thing with the sliced onions. Then sprinkle the last half teaspoon of salt over them, then cover the pan and set it in the oven at 300 degrees Fahrenheit, 150 Celsius for 3 hours or until the steaks are nice and tender. That's why chuck roast or shank or brisket would all be good cuts for this because they will benefit from that long cook time. You don't want to use something like a ribeye or a filet because it'll just be tough. When the meat is nice and tender though, take it out of the oven and then drain as much of the cooking liquid as you can and put it into a small saucepan. Then in another bowl, mix together the 1/3 cup of flour with about as much water. The recipe just says to make a paste. It doesn't actually say how much water to use, so I made a thick paste, but you can always make it thinner when you are preparing the sauce. So add the paste to the drippings and mix it in, and then cook it over a medium-high heat for 3 to 4 minutes until you have a well-thickened gravy. Again, you can add more water if you want. Then pour that over the meat. Now I gotta say, while this was cooking, the whole house smelled absolutely wonderful. A lot better than the pungent aroma of the sauerkraut soup that I made last year when I did a video on World War I German submarines. The infamous U-boat, or Unterseeboot, which literally means undersea boat. Our second dish is a lot simpler than the steaks, or at least I thought. Turns out that dehydrated shredded potatoes are a little finicky, but we're making them anyway. So for this recipe, what you'll need is 2/3 of a pound or 300 grams of dehydrated potato shreds, 1 quart or 1 liter of water, 2½ teaspoons of salt, 1½ cups or 350 milliliters of milk, and 4 tablespoons or 55 grams of melted butter. So I don't know if the dehydrated potato shreds of today are maybe different than the ones that they had in 1945. It's very, very possible. But this is one of those instances where just following the recipe did not work. It says to heat water to vigorous boil, pour over potatoes. Cover, let stand in warm place 15 minutes or over low heat 10 minutes. Add salt, stir vigorously 15 to 20 minutes or until smooth. Add milk and butter, whip until light, serve immediately. And I did just that. I heated the water to a boil, poured it over the potatoes, and covered them for 15 minutes. And it was in a warm place, but maybe it just wasn't as warm of a place as in a galley of a submarine or a battleship, because when I went to stir them vigorously, there was no way these things were going to get smooth. I even put them in a stand mixer for 15 minutes, only to have them be the exact same consistency as they were before. So I decided to boil them a little bit to hopefully soften them up. So I added a little bit more water and put them on a medium heat for 10 minutes. And they were definitely softer, but stirring them vigorously was still not going to ever make these things smooth. So at this point I said, to heck with it, they're mashed potatoes, so I'm just going to mash the potatoes. And that did work, to a point. They still had a firmer texture than any normal mashed potato, but they were good enough to add in the milk and the butter. Then the recipe says to whip them vigorously, so I put them back in the stand mixer, and after just a few minutes, they actually did end up looking like something that might pass as a mashed potato. But before we try these mashed potatoes and Swiss steaks, make sure to like this video. It really does help out the channel, and we can learn a bit more about what it was like to eat and cook aboard a U.S. submarine during World War II. Life aboard a submarine during World War II was tough. The U.S. lost 52 subs, and they had a fatality rate of around 20%, which, to be fair, is a lot better than the nearly 75% fatality rate of German U-boat personnel during the war. But it was still one of the most dangerous positions in the U.S. military, which is one reason why they got to eat a lot better than their above-water counterparts. Another reason was because spending up to 8 weeks in a metal tube beneath the waves can make a person go a little stir-crazy. And good food was there to provide a bit of comfort. And it was pretty much the only comfort that they had, because life in a sub was cramped. There were different classes of submarine, but on average they had 80 men aboard, 70 enlisted crew, and 10 officers. And they were quite a bit smaller than the modern subs in the Navy, having about 1/3 as much displacement. This means a lot less room per man. An enlisted man, in addition to his bunk, only got 1 square foot of personal storage space. On top of that, they typically smelled bad, a mingle of body odor, diesel fuel, cooking food, cigarettes, sometimes sewage. Not great. And it didn't help that when submerged, the engine room could get up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which would then heat up the entire sub. Now, US subs did have air conditioning, which none of the other countries had, but it didn't work to the effectiveness that it does today, so they were quite warm. So between all of that unpleasantness, plus the fact that they were constantly worried about depth charges and enemy torpedoes, this meant that an outsized portion of the crew's morale was in the hands of the cook on duty. And there was usually a chief cook with 2 to 4 other cook petty officers to help, and then there were often several mess cooks who did more of the grunt work of cleaning the galley, the scullery, and the mess area where the enlisted men actually ate. And sometimes they helped with food prep and serving as well. A former mess cook recalled there was an art to mess cooking. It was similar to lion taming. Drop your whip and the animals ate you. Now, the first job of the chief cook actually started before the patrol even began, because they were partly in charge of gathering the provisions for the submarine. And often, the length of a patrol was not dictated by how much fuel they had or the morale of the men, but rather from how much food they could cram into this steel tube. In those first days of a patrol, every inch of the sub was filled with provisions. Bilges and decks were crammed with boxes of fruits and vegetables. Canned goods were stuffed in every nook and cranny, from between torpedo tubes to inside of showers. Lockers were packed with cocoa and condiments, and you might share a bunk with a stack of number 10 cans of peaches or tomatoes. There were areas of the boat that tended to be drier, like forward of the motors, and so sugar could be kept in that area. And then there were areas that were particularly warm and damp, like the torpedo room bilges, and so coffee and flour, which were sealed in metal containers, were kept in there. In short, the space was very cramped, but not for long, because space freed up as they ate through those provisions. And so at the beginning of a patrol, the food tended to be better because they had a lot of fresh food aboard. Fresh fruit lasted about a week, and then fresh vegetables about 2 weeks. Milk was gone in 3, and then butter in about 4. Fresh eggs also lasted about a month when they were kept in a chill box. After that, they had to switch to powdered eggs. And there are stories of cooks saving some of the shells of the fresh eggs, and when they had switched over to powdered eggs, they would take the shells and kind of put them out in the kitchen so that they might trick the enlisted men to thinking that they were actually getting fresh eggs. But as someone who has eaten powdered eggs here on the channel before, I can tell you, nobody was fooled. They do not taste anything like, or really feel anything like, actual fresh eggs. And as things like fresh fruit and eggs ran out, it put more pressure on the other food that was aboard. Like, they usually had frozen meat, about 1.5 tons that was stored in the freezer. And then there was coffee, which was available at all hours and made with 10-gallon drip percolators, and was, along with cigarettes, the lifeblood of a submarine. Now, with that much coffee, you needed a lot of potable water, which, for many of the subs that were built during the war, wasn't a problem because they had big stills on board that could provide the ship with plenty of distilled water. So much so that they would often get weekly showers and even laundry done. But there were some older boats, like the S-boat, which didn't have that luxury, and water was at such a premium that washing and laundry were generally out of the question. According to one sailor on an S-boat at the time, the only person who really got to wash was the cook, and even then he was limited to 7 cups of water in a bucket. The wash-up consisted of washing the face, neck, arms, and hands using socks or skivvies as a rag. Next, the same water was used for the trunk, legs, and feet. Last came the privates. Then the socks and skivvies themselves were washed. It is said that some cooks then added the used water to the coffee urn after the socks and skivvies had been squeezed back into the bucket. I'm really sure that that is not true, but still it does put one off wanting to drink coffee aboard some of those smaller submarines. But if coffee wasn't your thing, then maybe you had, like me, a sweet tooth. And luckily, they did have ice cream. Yes, most of the submarines were outfitted with the great morale-boosting ice cream machine. And I actually did an entire video on ice cream in the Navy during World War II, a food that was so important to morale that the Navy had a dedicated ice cream barge. Other sweet treats might include pies or pastries or cinnamon buns for breakfast. There was actually a lot of baking that was done, partly because if the waves were really rolling and they couldn't sit down and have soups and sauces and everything at the table, then they relied on things like pastries and sandwiches made with fresh bread. Most of the baking was done during the mid-watch, between the hours of midnight and 4 a.m. Then, with a lack of counter space, the bread would be put to cool in bread lockers. And the USS Cod Submarine Memorial sent me a video of them opening one of these lockers, which was contained in a bench in the crew mess. It had holes in it so that the air could circulate and cool the bread. Of course, this did make easy access for cockroaches, and a lot of submarines did have a problem with cockroaches. They say that the USS Cod did not, at least during World War II, but other subs definitely did. Also, the USS Cod has a great YouTube channel where they walk you through all the different parts of the ship, and it's really well done, so I will put a link to their channel in the description. Now, all of this food was being served over 3 meals throughout the day, and each meal was broken up into 3 seatings because the mess was typically not big enough for all of the men to sit at. So they would have to cram them in, so most of the men were eating in about 10 or 12 minutes at most, as long as you were an enlisted man. Because if you were an officer, It was a totally different situation. Like I said before, the officers did eat the same food as the rest of the crew, but they didn't eat it in the crew mess, they ate it in the wardroom. Several stewards would bring the food from the galley to the officers' pantry, and there they would plate it up on nice china decorated with the fouled anchor. In addition, they had nice silverware and white linen tablecloths and napkins. They also typically didn't have the same time crunch that enlisted men did, so they could often sit there after their meal and enjoy a cigarette or a cigar. And while they were eating the same grub as all the other men, there were ways to spruce up the meal provided you had a good steward. Like the steward could use the officer's vacuum percolator to make the coffee rather than the drip coffee percolator that the men had. It was a much better cup of coffee. Also, as one officer, James Calvert, recalled, "I soon learned that having a steward who is liked by the ship's cook can be important. There are good cuts of meat, and then there are the other cuts." But even with a finer cut of meat and a better cup of coffee, officers still could not escape the fact that they were trapped in a metal tube on the rolling seas, especially when those seas were really rolling. The first meal of the big storm was roast pork and mashed potatoes. The stewards had soaked the white linen tablecloth and its soft underpad with water so that the plates and half-filled glasses would not slide. Bracing myself with one hand, I did my best to eat with the other. It was slow going, but I was making it. He says that then they brought some apple pie, but he decided not to stick around because one of the other officers had a rum-soaked cigar that he lit up, and it made the whole wardroom smell. Now, besides stormy seas, occasional seasickness, and an errant cockroach, there was one other thing that could really put a damper on the food, and that was the red light. I always wondered why in movies, in submarines, the lights go red at certain times, and it turns out there are actually several reasons, but one of the most important reasons is that it cuts down on the time that it takes your eyes to adjust from light to dark. So instead of like white light to dark, where it takes a while to adjust, if it goes red light to dark, it adjusts in just a couple seconds. Now, from what I understand, they usually just use these red lights when they are submerged or when they are going into combat, but maybe somebody who actually has spent time on a sub can confirm or deny or shed some more light on that. But it seems that during World War II, there was on at least one submarine a long period where all they had was red light. The initial novelty of living under red lights, with red mashed potatoes, black vegetables, and other unearthly colored foods, had worn off even before reaching Pearl Harbor. There it had served as a conversation piece, but now, 3 weeks later, I believed it was one of the factors affecting Wahoo's morale. But provided your food was the right color, and provided the seas were calm, it does seem that even as an enlisted man or an officer, eating aboard a U.S. submarine in World War II wasn't bad. But I am going to reserve judgment until I try this meal from the USS Ronquil from 1945. And here we are, Swiss steaks and mashed potatoes from a World War II U.S. submarine. So what I think is really cool is I found on eBay these fouled anchor plates. These are actually the plates. I got one dish and then one other plate that were used on the World War II submarines for the officers. I thought that was pretty cool. Let's start with these mashed potatoes, which I'm super curious about. Here we go. Okay, so the texture is, they're a little lumpy. There was some stuff that just wouldn't mash, but the flavor is really good. I mean, there's a bunch of butter and milk in there. It actually reminds me of like the mashed potatoes that we had in school as a kid, which were probably like flake potatoes. Pretty good. And now for the meat. Let me try to get a bit. Yeah, so it kind of just falls apart, which is nice. Get some onions, some tomato, the whole thing. There we go. That's really good. Fantastic. This is a really good meal. I'm not surprised. I mean, they were known for having good food. Everything Most everything I've ever made from the US Navy cookbook has been good, provided it doesn't use powdered eggs. Really don't like those. But this is definitely one of the best. Also, just one curious thing that I saw on the menu from the Ronquil is that they served fresh frozen corn. Is that a thing? It's either fresh corn or it's frozen corn. I don't see how it can be fresh frozen corn. Maybe somebody can explain that to me. Either way, this was really good. You should make it, and I will see you next. The diet of an ancient Roman soldier could be pretty monotonous, relying heavily on grains and salt pork. But once in a while, especially if you were an officer like a centurion, you would get access to fresh meat, so you could enjoy a dish like this pork with herb and wine sauce served with wheat pulse. So thank you to my Patreon patrons for supporting this channel for another year as I make a meal for a Roman centurion, this time on Tasting History. I've discussed the diet of an average Roman legionary before here on the channel, namely about how when they were on the march, they lived off mostly salted cheese, laridum, which was salt pork, and buccellatum, or hardtack. But very often the diet could have more variation than that, especially if you were an officer, whether you were a general in charge of the entire army, or a centurion in charge of, as the name would suggest, 100 men. Usually it was 80 fighting men and about 20 servants. So based on a number of ancient Roman writings, including lists of foods found in the officers' quarters at Vindolanda, one of the northernmost forts in Roman Britain, I was able to search through the most complete set of recipes that we have from ancient Rome, dere coquinaria, sometimes called apicius, to find a recipe that might have been served to a Roman centurion. It starts off small pieces of meat and fine wheat flour or cooked groats you also season with onokokti, and serve with small morsels of pork prepared with the same sauce. Onokokti can refer to a number of wine-based sauces, and there is a recipe for pork made with that sauce later on in the book. It is for Frontinian piglet. You bone it, brown and truss, put into a pot garum and wine, and tie together a bundle of leek and dill. Halfway through the cooking, add de frutum. When it is cooked, wash it and dry. Sprinkle with pepper and serve. Now, I've made entire piglets here on the channel before, but today I'm going to do a much smaller portion. So for this recipe, what you'll need is 2 pounds or about a kilogram of pork, 1 tablespoon of garum, or 1 teaspoon of salt. Now, rarely will you hear me suggest salt as an alternative for garum, garum being the fermented fish sauce that was oh so popular in ancient Rome. Typically, a better modern alternative would be Asian fish sauce. But in this case, since we're making something for the military, using salt is actually probably more appropriate than even using garum. Now, there is some evidence that garum was around certain forts like Vindolanda, but it was not common. In the Roman military, for most of the time, they preferred salt because it's more versatile. It can be used not just to flavor things, but also to preserve food, and it's a lot less cumbersome as it doesn't need to be transported in huge garum bottles. So for this version of the recipe, either one will work. Then 2 cups or 475 milliliters of wine, either red or white, 1 small leek, a small bunch of dill, 3 tablespoons de frutum, the modern equivalent being the reduced grape must known as mosto cotto, then a large pinch of pepper, and 1 cup or 200 grams of farro or other whole wheat berries. So start by preparing the farro in a saucepan with 2 cups or 475 milliliters of water, and then set it over medium-high heat and bring it to a boil. Then reduce the heat and simmer for 15 minutes. You can also crush the farro up a little bit if you want, and it'll just kind of make a thicker, gloopier pulse, but you can also leave it whole, which is what I'm doing. Now, as it simmers for 15 minutes, prepare your pork by adding a little olive oil to a pan, and then sear the pork, which should be cut into bite-sized pieces. Just sear them enough to give a little color on the outside. Then remove them from the pan and add in the wine and the garum or the salt if you're going to use that, and that should deglaze the pan. Let that come to a simmer and then add the pork back in along with the white part of the leek and the bunch of dill. Let this simmer for 4 or 5 minutes and then add the de frutum and continue to cook until the pork is done. With smaller pieces, it should take no more than another 4 or 5 minutes. As soon as it's cooked, take it off the heat and remove the pork from the pan, and then take about 3/4 of a cup or 175 milliliters of the wine sauce and add that to the farro, which should still be cooking. Stir it in and then let it cook for another 15 minutes or until it is nice and soft. Now, while this recipe is not too complicated, it is more complex than what the average ancient Roman legionary would have been eating, as they would have been cooking out on an open fire and they would have been eating out by that open fire. But it is something that an officer would have had access to, like a centurion who ate in their own tent and were served by servants. They would have had more access to the ingredients like defrutum and garum, which most of the people would not have. But everybody, at least at times, would have had access to the fresh meat. So make sure to like this video, subscribe to Tasting History, and I will tell you a bit about the fresh meat of the ancient Roman military. The eating habits of Roman military officers really varied depending on time, place, and their rank, as well as if they were trying to show that they were one of the people. Many Roman generals even would make an effort to be seen to be eating like the common soldiers. It was said of General Vespasian, future emperor of Rome, that he used to march at the head of his troops. His food was whatever chance offered. In his dress and bearing, he hardly differed from the common soldier. And during the Republic era, Plutarch wrote of the general Gaius Marius that it is a most agreeable spectacle for a Roman soldier when he sees his general eating common bread in public. But that's the thing, in public. It was a very Roman generals, they're just like us sort of thing. But evidence points to the fact that most of the officers, whether they were generals or centurions or really anything in between, definitely ate better than most of the soldiers most of the time. And you can see this partly in the words that the ancient Romans actually used to talk about the different groups eating. When speaking of soldiers, they typically use the phrase cibum capere, or to take food. But when discussing a centurion or other officer, they use the word epulare, meaning to dine or to feast. And that's because while the soldiers were just getting their rations and then cooking right there on an open fire and eating right there next to it, the Roman centurion or other officers had slaves or servants who were preparing the meals for them and then would serve them in their private tents. And even a centurion who was in charge of, 80 fighting men would not eat with those men. They ate with other centurions of varying ranks. It was a very hierarchical centurion society. There are even times when centurions would eat with consuls or emperors of Rome, and so they would really have access to the best quality wine, much more varied herbs, fruits, vegetables, and of course, plenty of fresh meat. Now, meat was important for everyone in the military, but it typically wasn't fresh meat, but rather smoked or salted meat. As Polybius says, the number of swine slaughtered in Italy to feed the army is very large, almost the whole of them supplied by the Po Valley. But if they were slaughtering all of these pigs before the campaign even started, obviously it was all preserved meat, either salted or dried or made into sausages or hams, things like that. So where exactly were they getting fresh meat? Well, it would often be acquired along the march. While the logistics and supply lines of the Roman army were incredible, not everything could be provided directly from Rome or the provinces, especially when the army was in distant provinces or in lands that were not even Roman territory. In those cases, the Roman military kind of had to live off of the land. There was a whole group of soldiers known as frumentatores who would go out every few days and acquire meat and vegetables and grain and other ingredients for cooking. Now, sometimes this meant simply foraging for food, but very often it meant purchasing it from local people, sometimes in a nice way, and sometimes kind of forced purchasing, and then there were times when there was actually pillaging, but it was not as common as you might think. And as the frumentatores gathered meat and other food, there were also aquatores who sought clean sources of water, and lignatores who gathered firewood, and then pablatores who collected fodder. The fodder fed the horses and the pack animals, but also fed another source of fresh meat, and that was the herds of animals, usually cattle, that accompanied the army, which were used to produce cheese, milk, and when needed, meat, which was prepared by the group of butchers who also accompanied the military. Now, some of these cows, along with pigs and sheep and goats, were slaughtered purely for food, but more often it seems that, at least in larger numbers, they were slaughtered for sacrifices to the gods, something called el lustratio, or purification of the army, which helped to ensure success in battle. Like before the Battle of Philippi, the army of Brutus and Cassius distributed great numbers of cattle for sacrifice among their cohorts. And then the meat would be cooked and served to everyone, no matter their rank. And I don't think it really actually worked, because Brutus and Cassius lost that battle pretty bad to Mark Antony, and Mark Antony's army was actually running low on supplies, and so they had to make sacrifices of just wheat. So maybe the sacrifice didn't really matter, and it was the general in charge of the army that really made the biggest difference. Now, even if the sacrifices didn't really play a big role in the outcome of the battle, the herds themselves could still play a pivotal role in combat, and not just as a wonderful source of calories. When on campaign in Iberia in 206 BC, the great Roman general Scipio Africanus used his herd of cattle as a method of luring his opponent into battle. He found a ravine that was particularly steep and then led the herd of cattle into the bottom, and then posted javelin men all around it and just sort of abandoned the cattle. When the Iberians quickly fell upon the animals, he let loose some of the javelin men. Well, flash forward 150 years, and Julius Caesar is on campaign in Iberia, and darned if those Iberians didn't try to use the same trick. But Caesar, neglecting the animals, attacked the men and conquered them. There are actually numerous accounts of Roman generals using food to entrap their enemies. Like Tiberius Gracchus, when in Iberia, upon learning that the enemy were suffering from lack of provisions, provided his camp with an elaborate supply of foods of all kinds and then abandoned it. When the enemy had got possession of the camp and had gorged themselves to repletion with the food they found, Gracchus brought back his army and suddenly crushed them. And it wasn't just the Romans, because the Numidian general Marhabal set out a bunch of, not meat, but wine when he was fighting some African tribes, and then to the wine he added mandragora, which was basically the ancient world's version of a sleeping pill. Then he provoked a fight and fled. When the barbarians captured the camp and in a frenzy of delight greedily drank the drugged wine, Maharbal returned and either took them prisoners or slaughtered them while they lay stretched out as if dead. Wine was actually just as important, if not more important, than meat to the Roman military, because a liter a day, which is what they typically drank, had 700 calories in it, and both good wine or bad wine that had gone sour, or just pure vinegar, was a wonderful antiscorubic, meaning it stove off scurvy. Or is it staved off scurvy? I'm not sure. Stove off scurvy? Staved off scurvy? Either one. Anyway, it's actually meat that we're talking about, so I'm going to get back to the meat. Now, we've seen that the Roman military had multiple ways of getting meat, whether it was foraging or pillaging or purchasing it, or having the herds come along with you. But what happened when the military was besieged in a city? Well, typically that actually just meant the end of the meat ration, unless there was a river nearby. For when the inhabitants of Mutia were blockaded by Antonius, Hirtius sent down the Scultena River carcasses of sheep, which were received and thus furnished the necessities of life. Now, as important as fresh meat was to the military diet, it was kind of seen as a luxury by most of the soldiers. Grain was what made up 75% of their calories, and then wine and vegetables and other things made up most of the rest, and then meat was just kind of a little bit. So while an officer might have more access to fresh meat, most of the fighting men just kind of saw it as a garnish. And so when there were times that they actually only got fresh meat, that proved to be a problem. Corbulo and his army, though they had sustained no casualties in battle, were yet beginning to feel the strain of short rations and hardship. They had been reduced to keeping starvation at bay by a diet of meat. And when Julius Caesar's army ran out of grain during a siege, they had to live off of exclusively fresh beef. And you would think that that was a good thing, but it was not. Yet never a word was heard from the men's lips unworthy of the dignity of Rome or of their previous victories. Nay more, when Caesar addressed single legions at work, and declared that if the burden of scarcity were too bitter for them to bear, he would raise the siege, one and all would beseech him not to do so. So as nice as it was to have fresh meat in the Roman military, it was only a good thing when it was accompanied by plenty of grain. And that is why I figured that this farro pulse and pork dish was the ideal meal for a Roman centurion. So once the farro is nice and soft, dish it up along with a good amount of the meat. Then sprinkle the top with pepper and garnish with some of the cooked leek and fresh dill. And here we are, pork and wheat pulse, fit for an officer in the legions of ancient Rome. Smells quite good. Definitely the wine and the dill are what I'm getting. I'm actually going to start just with some of this pulse. Super flavorful. You could grind it a little bit to make it smoother, but I kind of like it like this. Yeah, the onokokti, the wine sauce, really does elevate it, because otherwise it's just grain, kind of boring. This gives it some nice flavor. The garum is there, but it's very, very little. Again, if you wanted to use salt, that's perfectly fine. It's just that garum does add a really interesting flavor. Garum, however you want to say it. Now let me get some of the meat. I'm not going to hold it up. So it looks burnt. It's not, but it looks burnt because of the sauce that it was cooked in. But it smells really good. Here we go. Perfect texture. So there what I'm getting is the sweetness from the defrutum, and actually I wouldn't mind a little bit more of it. What's nice is that while the wine is important, it's not overwhelmingly just wine flavored, which it can be if you've cooked food in wine. It can become overwhelming when that is really the only liquid that's in there, except for a little garum. The dill comes through, the leek does not. So I don't know if maybe it would help to like sear the leek to kind of release the flavors and then add it in. I mean, that's not what the recipe says, but with ancient Roman recipes, they're always kind of up for interpretation. But that's why I put a little bit of leek just on the plate. It also adds some nice crunch. Very different texture. The cool thing is there are a bunch of different textures. You've got the wheat, the farro, which kind of like pops in the mouth. It's soft, but still like toothsome. And then obviously, you know what pork tastes like or feels like, but then the crunchiness of the leek is really nice. Yeah, I would actually eat like a whole bowl of this. So maybe I could do a stint as a Roman centurion as long as I didn't have to fight, because I don't think I would be particularly any good at that. Anyway, make this. It's quite good. Try some of those new ingredients. Try some garum, or just use salt if you want, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. Most people around my age know one thing about the Oregon Trail, and that's that you're likely to die of dysentery. But it turns out there was so much more to this 2,000+ mile trek west, including the fact that it took 4 to 6 months, and that you'd be having about 500 campfire meals, many of which would have been Johnny cakes and bacon. So thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video as we try not to die of dysentery. This time on Tasting History. So for those who don't know, the Oregon Trail was actually a collection of wagon trails that went from Independence, Missouri to Oregon City, Oregon. And from 1846 to 1869, about 400,000 settlers, farmers, miners, ranchers, and their families used it to cross 2,200 miles of prairie, desert, and mountain terrain. Now, it wasn't exactly a single trail, and there were people who would split off to go settle in California or Utah, but in general, for about half of the year, there were wagon trains heading west along a general trail. And the people in those wagons were known as emigrants, and every morning around 4 a.m., they would wake up, start making fires so they could prepare their breakfast. And one of the most common breakfasts was bacon, hoe cakes, or Johnny cakes, which are a corn cake, and coffee. Now, these Johnny cakes were very popular at the time. They had been popular since the 18th century, and they went under a host of names, including hoe cakes, but also Indian meal cakes or Indian corn cakes, which is what the Farmers and Emigrants Complete Guide from 1856 calls it. Written by Josiah T. Marshall, it says, take 1 quart of sifted Indian meal, 2 tablespoonfuls of molasses, 2 teaspoonfuls of salt, a bit of shortening, lard or butter, half as big as a hen's egg, stir these together, make it pretty moist with scalding water, put it into a well-greased pan, smooth the surface, and bake it brown on both sides before a quick fire. Now he does have instructions to make a fancier version that has milk and cinnamon and ginger, but I'm going to make this basic version because I feel like this is what most people would have been eating on most mornings on the Oregon Trail. I'm sure those people on the Oregon Trail would have really appreciated some free dessert. Alas, at least in the mornings, all they had was Johnny Cakes and bacon. They had other things, but to make Johnny Cakes and bacon, what you'll need is 2 cups or 300 grams of fine cornmeal, 1 tablespoon of molasses, 1 teaspoon of salt, 2 tablespoons or 30 grams of unsalted butter, and some boiling water. And then you'll also need some grease to grease the pan. And the best way to get grease, and probably how they would have done it, is to fry the bacon in that pan. It also should give the Johnny Cakes some nice bacony flavor. So first fry up your bacon however you like it, then set it aside but keep the grease in the pan. Then add the molasses, salt, and the butter into the cornmeal, and then work it all in by hand. Then pour some boiling water in and using a spoon, start mixing it together. Now the amount of water that you add is really up to you. For a firmer cake, you're gonna add about 3/4 of a cup of water, but you can add a little bit more for a looser cake. He's not super specific in how wet this mixture should be, but he does say that it should be smoothed on the top. So if it's too loose, you won't be able to smooth it. It'll just automatically do it. So I'm guessing it's a little firmer. So form up some round cakes by hand and then heat the grease up and carefully set the cake in. Now, unlike pancakes, which will have little bubbles form on the top that let you know when it's time to flip it, these don't have that, so you kind of just gotta eyeball it. For me, it took about 3 minutes on one side and then 2 minutes on the other side. So obviously, if we're able to make these, we know that the immigrants would have been bringing cornmeal, molasses, bacon, and salt. When it comes to the butter, they would have often brought a milk cow with them, and in the morning they would milk it, put it into a pail, and attach it to the bottom of the wagon. And throughout the day, the jostling of the wagon would actually churn it into butter that they would have that night, some nice fresh butter. But it wasn't all Johnny Cakes and bacon for every meal every day. So what else did those pioneers pack up to take with them before shouting, "Wagons! Ho!" So it's the 1850s, and you have just had it with the East Coast. So you're moving west using that newfangled Oregon Trail. So you make your way to Independence, Missouri, where you pack up your covered wagon. Now, these were not the really big covered wagons that were rambling down the streets of America at the time. No, these were smaller covered wagons known as prairie schooners. And you need to gather up 4 to 6 months worth of provisions and pack it all into this rather small wagon. Luckily, people who have gone before you have written down general guidelines of what you might need. And when it comes to food, which is what I'm concerned with, for 3 people, they say you should bring about 5 barrels or 1,080 pounds of flour, 600 pounds of bacon, 100 pounds of coffee, 5 pounds of tea, 150 pounds sugar, 75 of rice, 50 of dried fruit, 50 of salt, pepper, and other seasonings, and 10 pounds of saleratus, or baking soda. Other guides from the period say to bring about 200 pounds of lard, plenty of dried beans, dried fruit, and cornmeal, and of course about 120 pounds of hardtack. Many people also brought that milk cow as well as chickens for eggs. Now all this food was either packed in barrels or more often in provision boxes, which could be stacked and so they wouldn't jostle around too much, and they could be used for chairs and tables, which was really convenient when you had no chairs and tables. Now since there was no refrigeration, you might think that things like bacon and lard would go bad really quickly. But people would take that and pack it inside of the barrel that had the flour or the cornmeal to keep it away from any sun, and so it would stay for pretty much the entire journey. Now, in addition to food, you needed to bring some cooking utensils. This typically meant a frying pan, a Dutch oven, a kettle or coffee pot, tin plates and cups, and maybe a reflector oven, which would bounce the heat off of an open fire to bake cakes and pies. But in general, when it comes to packing, less is more. There was actually one pioneer from the time who had made the trek before, and he is scoffing at those he sees overpacking. They laid in an oversupply of bacon, flour, and beans, and in addition thereto, every conceivable gimcrack and useless article that the wildest fancy could devise, or human ingenuity could invent. Pins and needles, brooms and brushes, ox shoes and horseshoes, lasts and leather, glass beads and hawk's bells, jumping jacks and jew harps, rings and bracelets, pocket mirrors and pocket books, calico vests and boiled shirts. And much of this stuff would end up abandoned on the side of the trail within the first few weeks of travel. Now, the food that you're packing is not, of course, the only food that you're going to have on the journey. People were walking most of the 15 to 20 miles that they traveled each day because being in the wagon was really uncomfortable. It was really bumpy. They didn't have any shocks or anything, so most people were walking, so they were using up a lot of calories. So it was necessary to find extra victuals along the way. And in the early years, there were no shops or trading posts along the trail. But by the 1850s, forts like Fort Kearny and Fort Laramie would have stores where you could top off your provisions or replace anything that might have broken, provided that they had it, and they very often didn't. They were usually just as out of things as you were. But if they did have it, you were probably going to be paying like 5 times as much as you would back in Missouri, because what else are you going to do? A much less expensive way to get food, if a little more difficult, was to go back to your roots and hunting and gathering. And sometimes that would mean actual roots, things like wild onions and garlic, and something called camas root. The pioneer Phoebe Judson, writing about the American Indians she met, said the camas root, a very nutritious pear-shaped bulb about half the size of an onion, was their chief dependence. It was to them what bread is to us, the staff of life. After steaming the bulbs in a hole in the ground with hot rocks covered with ferns, they were dried. This, with game, was their usual diet. You could also go fishing, provided you knew how and were near a river, and if you didn't know how, you could also do like Phoebe Judson and just trade for some fish. When we reached Salmon Falls on Snake River, the Indians brought some red-meated salmon to the camp. Mr. Judson traded some sugar for a fine, large one, and as it was too late to cook it that night, he dressed it and put it into the water keg under our wagon. We were really so delighted with the prospect of salmon for breakfast that we could not sleep. But the next morning, when they woke up, our beautiful fish was missing, and so was Mr. Bryant's dog. As we never saw him again, he evidently indulged in too much salmon for breakfast and paid the penalty with his life. As for game meat, on the prairie at least, you had prairie dogs, which were supposedly very, very fatty, but also ducks and rabbits and geese and sage hens. They'd use these hens to make a soup with dumpling that most people seemed to really enjoy, but one woman did not. I think a skunk preferable. Their meat tastes of this abominable mountain sage. Now these were of course small little critters, good for maybe one meal, but if you wanted to save up some meat, they had big game like antelope and of course buffalo. But the thing is, even just a couple buffalo or bison is going to be so much meat that you're not going to be able to eat that all in one sitting, even if you've got several hundred people in the wagon train, so they would have to store it, and usually that meant making it into jerky. They would cut it into strips and then hang it on a rope around the edge of the wagon, and so as they went down the prairie, it would dry in the wind, and one person said it made all of the wagons look like they were decorated with a coarse red fringe. Now, most people really enjoyed the meat of the buffalo, but there is one story about a man who got an old bull, and I guess the meat was not very good. It tasted like the chef d'oeuvre of the devil's kitchen, the most offensive meat I ever tasted, and so that I found it impossible to eat it. But typically, the meat was very much loved. Now, the emigrants on the Oregon Trail rarely had time to stop to get any more buffalo than they could eat or carry. But it was around this time that other people with more sinister intentions were decimating the buffalo population in an effort to destroy the food source of the Plains Indians. In 1864, near the end of the Oregon Trail era, one emigrant wrote that some of our men went today hunting for buffalo and antelope, but saw none. While the bleached bones of the buffalo are strewn all along the road, not an animal was seen. The needless and wanton slaughter of these once numerous animals has almost caused them to be extinct. The thing is, it wasn't just the meat of the buffalo that both the Plains Indians and the pioneers relied on, it was their poop. See, if you've ever seen the Great Plains, you'll notice there aren't a lot of trees, not a lot of firewood going on. And so they would gather the chips or the poop of the buffalo to start fires. And I guess as long as it's dry, it burns really well and doesn't smell that much. Many of the ladies can be seen roaming over the prairie with sacks in hand, searching for a few buffalo chips to cook their evening meal. Some of the ladies are seen wearing gloves, but most of them have discarded their gloves and are gathering the buffalo chips with their bare hand. And with your dried buffalo poop in hand, it was time to actually get to cooking. And this is where the pioneers they really impressed me, because especially in the first part of their journey, where they still had a lot of the ingredients that they were bringing, they were making up some really fancy, complicated foods, if not, maybe not fancy, but complicated foods. They would always have fresh bread that could be risen with either Salertus, which is baking soda, or the newfangled Preston's yeast powder, no excuse for bad bread. And should they run out of these, they would make salt rising bread, which is just ingenious. So you know how like a sourdough starter relies on yeast to build up, to rise the bread? Well, salt rising bread relies on bacteria. Usually the ingredients were just water, salt, flour, and then some cornmeal or dried potato. And it needed to be kept warm all day. So they would make it up and then put that that starter in the front of the wagon where it was warm and the sun was hitting it, and it would start to rise. And then that night they could use it to make fresh bread. Absolutely brilliant. But even more impressive than the bread was the fact that they were making pies and cakes out there. There are letters that talk about fresh-made antelope pot pie and pound cake and peach pie and apple pie, though often the apple pie was made with dried apples, which I guess was not always the best thing, as there was a slogan during the time that said, "Spit in my ears and tell me lies, but give me no dried apple pies." Now, the meal that they seemed to go hog wild for was the 4th of July dinner. Part of it was that it was a big celebration because it's 4th of July, but also it was around the halfway point for many of the immigrants. And so they would kind of splurge and use up a lot of the good things that they still had left. In 1849, William Swain wrote about the midday meal on the 4th of July. Dinner consisted of ham, beans, boiled and baked, biscuits, John cake, apple pie, sweet cake, rice pudding, pickles, vinegar, pepper sauce, and mustard, coffee, sugar, and milk. All enjoyed it well. The boys had raked and scraped together all the brandy they could, and they toasted, hurrayed, and drank till reason was out and brandy was in. I stayed till the 5 regular toasts were drunk, and then, being disgusted with their conduct, I went to our tent, took my pen, and occupied the remainder of the day in writing to my wife. Or at least that's what he told her he did, I'm sure. Now, since this was a time when provisions started to run low, at least the more luxurious provisions, there were, of course, people who had already gone through them. George Keller had a 4th of July dinner on musty hard bread and beef bones in a state of incipient putrefaction. And Amos Steck said that it was just like any other day for him, and he had spent it driving a slow ox team in a sandy road, his eyes filled and his throat choked with it, with no other refreshment than hard bread for dinner, and poor bread at that. He will feel little patriotic ardor stimulating him even on this great day. Granted, these were the wagon trains that were made up of pretty much just men, because it was the women who did most of the real cooking. As James Hutchings lamented, "I wish I had taken lessons in the art of every man his own washerwoman, cook, and general housewife." But whether or not you could cook didn't really matter when you started to run out of ingredients, which would happen the further down the road you got. All of the little delicacies we brought with us from home were gone, and we had nothing left but flour, bacon, beans, sugar, and tea. And like the children of Israel, my soul loathed this food, and I longed for something fresh. The farther we traveled, the more meager became our fare. This was the time when the pioneers came to rely on things like buffalo jerky, hardtack, and portable soup. This was something where you would boil down the meat and bones of an animal so much that it became just this gelatinous kind of layer on the bottom of a pot. And then you would cut that up and let it dry, and you could take that then and later put it into some water and make a soup. It was like a bouillon cube. Then there was something called meat biscuit. 1 pound of it contained the nutriment of 5 pounds of the best fresh beef. It will keep in perfect preservation for any length of time. In tight tin canister or casks, the traveler across the plain can always have a fresh supply of food easily and quickly prepared. Now, the problem with the dwindling food supply was not just that it left everyone rather hangry, but also depressed, because when you're traveling every single day, all day, it's kind of boring and monotonous, and the only thing people were looking forward to was their next meal. Eating was the best part of the day, even in the harshest conditions. Ate breakfast this morning in a snowstorm, and although the prospect did look rather gloomy, still we kept in good cheer, and our victuals, crusted not with sugar but snow, certainly disappeared in a manner that plain showed that we had not lost our appetites, even if we were experiencing all the delights of a snowstorm in the open prairie. It was also around this time that they started to run out of lemon extract. See, they would often add lemon extract and maybe a little sugar to their water to make a sort of lemonade, because the water did not taste good. It was hard to find any kind of thing resembling clean water at all, but especially out in the prairie, everything was covered in dust. All of their stuff, themselves, their food, and their water just caked in dust. And so they would often add aluminum ammonia sulfate to the water, which would kind of help purify it, but it made it taste absolutely awful. When they didn't have that, they would just put cornmeal into the water and wait like 20 or 30 minutes. And as the cornmeal dropped to the bottom, it would take some of the dirt with them, leaving a little clean-ish water on the top, but still didn't taste great. And with people running out of their luxury items, their food, and sometimes clean water, the Oregon Trail was about to do them real dirty when they came upon Fort Laramie, also dubbed Camp Sacrifice. This was the last major stop before you headed over the Rocky Mountains. And as difficult on the oxen as it's been to drag your butt across the Great Plains, it's going to be even harder for them to drag it up the Rocky Mountains. So you had to get rid of everything that was extra. And I don't mean just like things like books and fine china and things that are kind of not necessary, though they did get rid of those. But in some cases, even things that were necessary if it was deemed too heavy. There was one wagon train who just needed to lighten the load, and so they discarded a ton of bacon, several barrels of bread, 6 dozen steel shovels, axes, hoes, etc., etc., amounting in value to nearly $1,500. Also, I love how they used to write etc., which was the ampersand C, because the et in etc. literally means and. I just think that's cool. I don't think anybody ever writes that anymore. Now it's just etc. Anyway, one thing that someone had to discard kind of brings a tear to the eye. A man named Smith had a wooden rolling pin that it was decided was useless and must be abandoned. I shall never forget how that big man stood there with tears streaming down his face as he said, "Do I have to throw it away? It was my mother's. I remember she always used it to roll out her biscuits, and they were awful good biscuits." It's really amazing what these people went through and gave up to start this new life. And I don't just mean giving up their mother's rolling pin, but giving up everything that they had left behind. Many of these people would never again see the family and friends that they had known back east. And I don't think I could have done it. I really don't think I could have lasted very long doing 6 months of hard living, hard traveling, and hard eating. Maybe a week. I think I could have lasted a week. Maybe 2 if these Johnny cakes taste as good as they smell. And here we are, a pioneer breakfast of Johnny cakes and bacon from the Oregon Trail. So sometimes people would have put like honey or syrup or more molasses on these, but I'm going to just try them, still hot, as is. Here we go. So the texture is a little, it's not dry, it's almost like gritty, but not unpleasantly so, but it's kind of, it's a little grittier than I might like. but the flavor is really, really good. I kind of expected them to be bland, but they're not. It's, you know, it's kind of like cornbread, which cornmeal. It's like cornbread and molasses mixed together, so you kind of get that sweetness, but then the fact that it's like fried basically in bacon grease, that's really nice. And you get a really, really nice bacony flavor to it. It kind of reminds me of like a 19th century version of a McDonald's McGriddle. I actually think that that these are gonna grow on me. This is something I could eat one or two of them. They're a little, I think it's just that they're a little more dense than like a fluffy pancake because there is nothing in there to raise it. No raising agent, so it's just kind of heavy. But it comes with bacon. The bacon, of course, is it's just bacon, but it's really fatty bacon because that's what they would have had, so I got the fattiest that I could find. And it's really, really good. Also, how cool is this fork? I got it from Townsend's. They have a bunch of really just cool stuff from this period, mostly earlier 18th century, but I thought it fit. Plus, it's just cool looking. So I think these are something that you should try. It's totally worth it. Maybe swap out some of the, you know, water for milk, or just kind of play with it. You can add some spice, make the fancier version. But even as is, especially, you know, if you're going across the prairie and you're really hungry, it's a great meal. So give these a try, don't die of dysentery, and I will see you next time on Taste. Few things improve troop morale better than a hot meal, even if the name of that hot meal kinda sucks. Like this favorite frontline breakfast from World War II, creamed dried beef on toast, better known as shit on a shingle. So thank you to my Patreon patrons for constantly supporting this channel, especially on videos like this that'll probably get demonetized because I keep saying shit on a shingle. This time on Tasting History. So I am releasing this video on Veterans Day, or Armistice Day, or Remembrance Day, depending on where you are. And every Veterans Day, I remember my grandpa, Gramps, who used to tell me stories about when he was in World War II. He was part of the medical corps, and he would tell me these stories about when he was over in England and France and even in Germany just after the end of the war. And I credit those stories with giving me my love for history, because here I am, a 7-year-old playing with his micro machines, and this old guy is telling me about stuff that happened to a 7-year-old so long ago. But the way that he told the stories was so engaging and made it so personal that I was entranced, and I just loved him. I couldn't get enough. And so I guess you can kind of say that the reason that Tasting History is a thing is because of those stories that my veteran Gramps used to tell me. And so I figure, what better way to honor my grandpa here on this Veterans Day than to make a dish that he might have eaten when he was in the military, even if he very purposefully left it out of the stories he was telling his 7-year-old grandson. Because there was no way my grandpa would ever say the phrase "shit on a shingle." Or as the recipe from the US War Department in 1944 called it, creamed dried beef, which for 6 gallons called for 7 pounds of dried beef, a pound of fat melted, flour, evaporated milk, water, and pepper. Separate beef into small pieces, mix melted fat and flour, stir until smooth. Mix milk and water, heat. Add gradually to flour mixture, stirring constantly. Add chipped beef and pepper. Heat to boiling point, reduce heat, and simmer about 10 minutes. Note: serve hot over toast. Now obviously, since this makes 6 gallons or 100 servings, I'm going to make a reduced quantity today, but I do think it's really interesting how they give the quantities in the original recipe. Besides pounds and gallons, they also measure in number 56 dippers. Like 1 pound of fat would be a half number 56 dipper, because you wouldn't often have a scale on hand when you were out in the field, but you would probably have the standard quart-sized number 56 dipper. And the writing on the dipper was so standard that you could use it to make measurements as well. Another book specifies 1 cup of liquid comes to the top of the date figure, 2 cups to the top of the manufacturer's letter, and 3 cups of liquid will come to the top of the US letters. I of course have no dipper, and I'm not making 6 gallons worth, so for a smaller portion, what you'll need is just over half a pound or 250 grams of chipped beef. So this is chipped beef or dried beef, and they come now in these little jars. You'll need 4 for this recipe. And it's basically ground very salted beef that is then pressed into a form, dried, and then sliced very thinly. And when you open it, kind of reminds me of the smell of a can of dog food when you open it. But that smell goes away, kind of. But it's all wrapped up like this, and they kind of remind me of Pringles. Yeah, so this is what you need for this recipe. Then 2 tablespoons or 30 grams of fat. This recipe is not specific in what kind of fat, but in the cook's manual from 1910, which may be the earliest recipe for this dish, it says butter is preferred, so that's what I'm using. A heaping 1/3 cup or 40 grams of flour, 1½ cups or 350 milliliters of evaporated milk, 1½ cups or 350 milliliters of water, 1 teaspoon of black pepper, and a few slices of bread for toast. So the recipe from 1910, which was probably used during World War I, also includes parsley and uses beef stock. It also uses 15 pounds of chipped beef for 60 servings rather than 7 for 100 servings like the World War II version. So it was 4 ounces per serving, and then by World War II it was just over 1 ounce per serving. Just thought that was interesting. But to make the World War II version of SOS, chop the chipped beef into small pieces and then peel everything apart and put it into a bowl and soak it with some water. Some old recipes say that the beef is so salty that it needs to be scalded in boiling water. I don't think the modern version is as salty, so if you soak it for 15 or 20 minutes, that's going to be just fine. While it does, mix the evaporated milk and water together and heat it over low heat. Then separately melt the butter over low heat in a pot and add the flour and whisk together. Let it cook for about a minute, then slowly pour in the hot milk mixture. You want to constantly be stirring and let it cook for 3 or 4 minutes while it thickens. Then whisk in the pepper, then finally add the chipped beef. Then bring the pot to a boil and then turn the heat down so it just simmers for about 10 minutes, and it'll thicken up even more during that time. Now, one of the things that actually inspired me to do a video for Veterans Day was a conversation that I was having with an old friend that I used to know in New York who now runs a website called veteranlife.com. The site is dedicated to providing veterans and military families with different resources and benefits that they might not otherwise know of. And it actually also has a lot of wonderful things for civilians, because I am about as civilian as you can get, and yet I spent time on this site because they have a whole area of military history. I read a wonderful story about the Navy's ice cream barges from World War II. They were basically giant floating refrigerators in the Pacific that provided ice cream to the sailors. And I think that is going to have to be the topic for a video in the future. But for now, let's talk about the men who would have been making that ice cream, or more specifically, on a shingle. So whenever discussing a topic as large as American military cooking during World War II, there are so many variables and situations that there are going to be exceptions to everything and exceptions to the exceptions. There was fighting going on all over the world, and there were different levels of preparedness at any given time, so even the military's best laid plans often went awry. But in general, this is what things should have been like if you were cooking in a field kitchen. Typically, each company of about 150 to 200 men would have their own field kitchen with maybe a half a dozen cooks. With some help, they could set up the entire kitchen in under 30 minutes. The goal was to have the kitchen close to the men that they were feeding, but depending on a lot of things, terrain, the proximity to the enemy, sometimes they could be 100 yards back or 10 miles back. The nice thing about being further back is then they could often team up with 3 or 4 other kitchens to become a battalion-sized kitchen. Also, being further back meant that they would be less likely to be the target of enemy fire, so that they could maybe do some cooking during the day, because if they were too close, then all the cooking had to be done before sunup and after sundown. Now, the kitchen could be anywhere from a nearby building to a tent to the back of a truck, but they all had the same equipment. Most important was the gasoline-powered M1937 range stove. It was very versatile and could perform all of the functions of any stovetop and oven in a normal kitchen. They were of course rather compact, but usually a company had 2 or 3 that they could work with. And one training video from World War II said,
"If you lose your oven, take a couple of barrels, cover them with clay, and bake your bread."
Now, some of the other equipment included large immersion heaters that could heat up a barrel or even a huge tub of water rather quickly, that could be used then for cleaning dishes or for making food and for taking a hot bath. preferably using new water. And speaking of water, when it came to drinking water, it needed to be purified and then was kept in a Lister bag. This was meant to distribute purified water for up to 100 men. Then there were Mermite cans. These were insulated containers, usually 7 gallons, and meant to hold 3 or 4 inserts. Like a giant thermos, they kept things hot or cold and were often used when the kitchen was far from the front line. Food could be prepared at the kitchen and then put into the containers, into the Mermite can, put on a truck, and brought to the front line to serve the men. But if you were doing this, you really wanted to pay attention to which Mermite can you took, because some were labeled with ETO blood bank, with blood meant for transfusions given near the front lines. Mixing those up would be a mistake you would not make twice. But assuming that you got the right can, what kind of meals are you loading them with? Well, officially, you have very little say in it. Especially starting around World War II, there was a big push to make sure that the troops were getting enough of the right minerals and vitamins, and so dishes and entire menus were created by nutritionists back in Washington. And in one video from 1943 about the nutrition program, they talk about how they started out by examining the diets of the enemy armies. The Japanese were supposed to have extreme energy given to them by a simple handful of rice, and
The Nazis are supposed to have a Superman vitamin pill.
though the attempt at replicating the effects of this pill with mere vitamins did not really work, because actually this superhuman pill was something called Pervitin, which had methamphetamine that would give the Germans a lot of energy if short-lived. Some say that the Blitzkrieg couldn't have happened without Pervitin because some soldiers had to stay up for days at a time. But while vitamin B might have not replicated the effects of Pervitin, the military did put together a top-notch diet plan for the cooks out in the field to follow. Menus for dinner could include chicken a la king with lyonnaise carrots and an apricot upside-down cake for dessert. And all of the ingredients would be dried or salted or otherwise preserved and shipped all the way from the US to the front lines all over the world. But of course, most of these ingredients never actually made it to where they were going, or at least not in a timely fashion, so you didn't have everything at once, so the field cooks usually had to cobble something together with what they had available. Though depending on their location, that could be something pretty nice depending on where you were. When the 10th Mountain Division was in Italy in 1945, Corporal John Stone said, "We used lots of fresh Italian ingredients, as much as we could no matter what we were cooking. We also learned to cook a lot of pizza. This woman and her daughter, they taught us how to do it right." You made do with what you had, and many times that actually meant field rations. Basically, if you were near the front, at least one meal a day was going to be pre-packaged field rations. And for some troops, it could be every meal, every day, for days or even weeks on end. Now, I want to do a whole video on the field rations of World War II and how they evolved into the modern MRE, or meal ready to eat. And actually, I should try to do that with Steve MRE, who actually eats these old foods. I'll put a link to where you can watch him eat actual rations from World War II. But since it was part of a cook's job to make sure that everyone had the field rations that they would need, we should touch on it now. So there were lots of types of field rations that you could get depending on where you were and at what point during the war you were at. But between 1942 and 1945, the two most common were the C ration and the K ration. The C ration was 3 meals, each made up of an M unit or meat unit and a B unit, which was the bread or dessert. The M unit was the main dish. You could have beef stew with peas or a canned meat and vegetable stew. At the beginning of the war, there was pretty much only different stews, but later on, you might have meat and spaghetti and tomato sauce, eggs and potatoes, or pork and beans. Then the B unit had some hardtack, though it was supposedly softer and easier on the teeth than that of previous wars, the biscuits being made of soybeans, wheat, egg, and lard.
Pretty tasty biscuit.
Then there'd be some coffee powder or sometimes lemon drink. Then there'd be some sugar, salt, maybe chocolate, and often cigarettes and gum. All told, the 3 meals provided 3,700 to 3,800 calories per day and could be eaten cold, but were better when they were cooked. Now, the C ration was a good amount of food and was quite varied, but it was heavy. And so if you were remote or a paratrooper, you would get the K ration. They weighed less, partly because they had less calories. They had 2,830 calories per day, and were supposed to be much less edible. Things like the fatty pork loaf and the maltose and dextrose tablets would often just get thrown out by the troops. The thing is, the K ration was meant to be used for no more than 5 days, but there are stories of soldiers living almost exclusively off of them for weeks at a time. One unit, known as Merrill's Marauders, lived almost exclusively on K rations for 5 months in Burma. And after 5 months of fatty pork loaf every day, imagine how happy they would have been to walk into a field kitchen and be offered something like a plate of hot on a shingle. So once everything is simmered for about 10 minutes, toast your bread and then ladle the creamed beef onto the toast and serve. And here we are, World War II creamed dried beef. I'm gonna kind of spread it around here on the shingle because I feel like they gotta go together. All right, here we go. That's not bad. All right. It needs the shingle. The toast is really necessary for the texture, because once the toast kind of had softened, the texture of the actual beef, it's not terribly pleasant. It's just kind of chewy. That said, the flavor of the whole thing, not that bad. In fact, it actually reminds me of the gravy that my grandpa used to make, though he would put it over biscuits, and it was made with bacon fat. So if you want to make this with bacon fat, it is quite good. That said, the flavor is good. It could use more spice, probably, some more pepper. I mean, it's a pretty small amount of pepper for that quantity that they used. So you could add more pepper. You're not being rationed, hopefully. What I would think is actually really good is just a different meat, like ground up sausage or cut up bacon or something like that. Something that just the texture is a little more pleasing to the palate. That said, when you compare it to a lot of military foods, it's not that bad, especially the older military foods out in the field. This one, I could see looking forward to it. Anyway, if you are a veteran or in the military or a part of a military family or just interested in military history and lifestyle, make sure to visit veteranlife.com. And for those of you lucky enough to have a grandparent still around, even if they weren't in World War II, go ask them to tell you a story, because I'm sure that they would love to, and you'll appreciate it when you're older. So don't forget to like, subscribe, have a fantastic Veterans Day or Armistice Day or Remembrance Day, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. June 6, 2024 is the 80th anniversary of the Allied invasion of Normandy, D-Day. And while I'm sure that there are going to be lots of videos and articles coming out soon about this most pivotal moment of World War II, I don't think many are going to cover what I'm covering, and that is the importance that food played on that day. Like how troops sustained themselves on meals like these powdered eggs and bacon, toast, and lemonade. So thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video as we make the last meal before D-Day. This time on Tasting History. So I just wanted to give you a heads up that this episode is the last episode of Tasting History that will be filmed in this kitchen, because tomorrow the contractor and all those people come to break everything up because I'm getting new cabinets, because I need more storage. I always need more storage. But that doesn't mean that I'm not going to be having episodes while they do that for the next month or so. It's just that I won't be here. I'm going to have to find some other spaces to film in, so same show, different kitchens, and when I get back to this kitchen, it will also be different. And I think it's rather fitting that for my last meal here in this kitchen, I'm going to be making the last meal that many troops ate before leaving England to cross the English Channel and land on the beaches of Normandy. Now, there were numerous countries involved in the invasion. There were troops from the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Norway, France, Belgium, Greece, and the Netherlands, and a handful of other countries. But regardless of nationality, on that morning of June 6th, most accounts that I found agreed that they had a breakfast similar to the one that Robert Adams of the USS Samuel Chase ate. On June 6th at 0500, we dressed, and if you hadn't written home, why, you did then. That last-minute note to home to tell whether or not you were going to make it. Then breakfast. Eggs, bacon, toast, and juice. It was excellent. Now, excellent is a relative term based on how well they were eating before. That day, the food was not great at the moment, but some people did get fresh eggs, which was a real treat at the time, but some people didn't get fresh eggs. They got powdered eggs, and that's actually what they would have been used to. And that's what I'm going to make because it's just more interesting than just me making fresh eggs here. So I'm going to be using a recipe from this, which is the World War II edition of the U.S. War Department's cookbook for the U.S. Army, and there is a recipe in here for powdered scrambled eggs. Number 749, scrambled eggs. Water, cold, 2.5 quarts. Eggs, powdered, 1.5 pounds. Salt to taste, pepper to taste, lard or bacon fat, 1 pound. Sift eggs, pour 1/3 of the water into a utensil suitable for mixing eggs, add powdered eggs, stir vigorously with whip or slit spoon until mixture is absolutely smooth, tip utensil while stirring. Add salt, pepper, and remaining water slowly to eggs, stirring until eggs are completely dissolved. The recipe then goes on to have them cooked in lard or bacon fat, and we're going to get that bacon fat from the following recipe, which is recipe number 750, diced ham or bacon and scrambled eggs. Add 3 pounds of ham or bacon to basic recipe for scrambled eggs. Omit lard. Fry ham or bacon until crisp and brown. Pour egg solution over meat and fat. Stir and cook as in basic recipe. Additional fat may be needed if ham is used. Now, of course, this recipe was meant to feed a small platoon, so I'm going to be cutting it way back to just use 1/2 pound of bacon and 1/6 of the powdered eggs. So first, sift 1/4 pound or 115 grams of the powdered eggs into a wide bowl, then pour in a little over 1/2 cup or 120 milliliters of cold water and whisk until the mixture is nice and smooth. Add about 1/2 teaspoon of salt and 1/2 teaspoon of pepper and whisk those in. Then slowly add another cup or 235 milliliters of cold water, just a little at a time as you whisk. Keep stirring until it's completely dissolved, and that is your egg solution. Then it's time to fry up the bacon, and while they were in the UK making this, the bacon was actually coming from the US, so you do want US style bacon. So you're going to dice that up into cubes about 1/2 inch square, then heat a large pan over medium-high heat and add the bacon in, and let it cook for 5 or 6 minutes or until all of the fat has melted out and the bacon has become a nice dark brown. Then lower the heat to medium-low and then add the egg solution. The recipe says they should be slowly stirred as they thicken and that it should be removed a little before they look done, as they will continue to thicken after being removed from the heat. I cooked mine for about 2 minutes. Now, with his bacon and eggs, Robert Adams said that he had some toast, which is easy enough to make, and some juice. But I'm not exactly sure what kind of juice it was, and this book doesn't mention juice. Maybe it was just orange juice, I don't know. But there is a recipe in here for lemonade, and it's a little different, uses powdered lemon, so I'm gonna make that close enough, and it's more interesting than just me making juice. But before I do that, let's take a closer look at what else those troops ate on that June day, 1944, both before, during, and after the invasion. By the end of May 1945, southern England had become the world's largest military base, with almost 2 million men ready to participate in the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. 54,000 of those men were dedicated to keeping the other 1.9 million fed, watered, and supplied, and 4,500 were dedicated entirely to cooking meals. Unfortunately, the food in England at this time is what for decades to come would give the country a reputation for less than quality cuisine. As an American recalled, we were issued sack lunches. These consisted of 2 sandwiches made of dry brown bread. One had a glob of jelly in the middle, the other a slice of pork luncheon meat. We called them Spam and Jam lunches. But in the days leading up to D-Day, all of that changed because the troops that were involved in that first landing were sequestered, basically. They were brought to camps on the south coast of England and not allowed to leave, but the food was decidedly improved. We were incarcerated behind barbed wire, and MPs made sure that no one entered or left camp. No soldier inside the compound was allowed to talk to anyone outside. He could suffer the possibility of getting shot. This was serious business. Brand new equipment was issued, and the new weapons had to be test-fired and zeroed in on the firing range. Unlimited amounts of ammo were given to each of us for practice firing. Bayonets and combat knives were honed to a keen edge. Steak and pork chops with all the trimmings, topped off with lemon meringue pie, were items on a typical menu, and it was all you can eat. This caused one of the wags to say, "They're fattening us up for the kill." Other troops recalled having access to white bread and fresh eggs, both rarities in England at the time, and some even got ice cream. Then they would also play movies in the tents, first-run movies in the tents on the base, where they would hand out candy and popcorn to the troops. The issue is, while everybody knew that they were getting ready to go to France, nobody knew exactly when it was going to happen, and they didn't find that out until a very early morning breakfast call. I was awakened at 2 o'clock in the morning from a sound sleep. The officer of the day came running, shook me, said, "Come on, get up. Time to get up. We're going to have breakfast in about half an hour, and then briefing." Breakfast at that time of the morning and briefing? There was something going on. So we did it. We all got up and dragged our butts out the door. This was that breakfast of eggs and bacon, and there are a few accounts of disgruntled Americans being on a certain British boat that was serving kidney stew, but for the most part, whether you were American, British, Canadian, or otherwise, it was eggs and bacon. They gave us a good breakfast of eggs, bacon, anything you wanted, yeah. Even coffee. They had taps on the wall. You just turned the tap on and out came coffee. God, the life of luxury. Well, after breakfast, we just manned our equipment and waited to land. That was all. And while Sergeant Eddie Wallace of the Royal Artillery Company was impressed with that breakfast, others seemed to be pressed into eating that breakfast. Basically, if you were going to France, you were eating those eggs. We had a fried egg breakfast washed down by a tot of rum. Not my choice, but mandatory for all those going ashore. And honestly, it probably would have been better had they not had that breakfast, as they all boarded into small boats going across choppy waters to a place that they knew that they might die, and the air was filled with diesel fumes because everybody threw up. They gave us paper bags to throw up in and throw over the side. We were seasick, soaking wet. Though this bout of seasickness does seem to be mostly among the troops who were on the small landing craft called Higgins boats, one of which I actually got to see when I recently visited the World War II Museum in New Orleans. And if you ever get down to New Orleans, definitely go to that museum. It's absolutely fantastic. And if you're really into World War II, make sure you have 2 days, because I only had one and it was not enough. It's a fantastic museum. Anyway, it does seem that it was mostly the troops who had the seasickness, because of course the Navy men, they were used to it, even if they had been drinking on an empty stomach. Like the crew of the USS LCI-94. The skipper of the vessel was nicknamed Popeye, and he had commanded the boat during landings in North Africa, Sicily, and Salerno, Italy. So he knew what was about to happen, and so he made sure that his boat was well stocked with plenty of J&B Scotch, and he told his cook that it was his duty that day to go around to the crew and keep giving them a drink until they didn't want any more or until we ran out. Essentially, we drank most of the day. Didn't have any food, but I drank all day and didn't get the least bit intoxicated. It had absolutely no effect. This was the same man who saved his crew by basically not following orders that day. See, his boat, LCI-94, was one of numerous LCIs, Landing Craft Infantry, which many of the men said actually stood for Lousy Civilian Idea, that were supposed to go up to the beach, drop off their men, and then leave the beach and go back out into the ocean. Well, when he saw where they were supposed to land, he said, that's not going to happen. We will never get off that beach alive, because he had already seen several other boats go up and be just decimated with machine gun fire and mortar fire, and some of the boats were completely blown up. So instead, he went 100 yards down the beach so he could get closer to where they weren't firing as much. The problem is, it seems like an easy thing, just go 100 yards down the beach, but there were mines over there. They had only picked certain places to get rid of the mines, and so he had to maneuver around the mines, which he did successfully, and he couldn't get that close to the beach. They actually beached way out, so when the men did get off the boat, it was like up to their shoulders in water. So it was a little difficult for them to get to the beach, but it made it so more of the troops actually ended up surviving. I think 90% ended up getting to the beach, and most of his crew also survived before they were able to get out and turn back around. But since he dropped off all of those troops in really deep water up to their shoulders, they had to trudge through the water wearing these really heavy backpacks, about 70 to 100 pounds of gear, part of which would have been their rations. We carried one set of K rations, a breakfast, dinner, and supper, and 3 D bars. The K ration were the most common for the American troops. Each meal included some sort of canned meat product like ham and eggs for breakfast, pork and cheese for dinner, and a beef and pork loaf for supper. They also included things like biscuits, water purification tablets, dried fruit bars, sugar, powdered drinks, chewing gum, toilet paper, and cigarettes, and they provided 2,830 calories a day. The D-bars he mentioned are a type of chocolate created by Hershey and were designed to, and I quote, taste a little better than a boiled potato. This was because the D ration was meant for emergencies. It was called an emergency ration, so if it tasted too good, the Army was worried that the men would eat those before attacking their K rations. The British soldiers actually had a special D-Day assault ration pack, or the 24-hour ration A. This included 10 biscuits, 2 blocks of oatmeal, 1 block of meat and meat extract tablets, 3 slabs of chocolate, 2 with raisins and 1 without, boiled sweets, 2 packs of chewing gum, 4 pieces of toilet paper, and all the necessary ingredients to brew up a good pot of tea. The thing is, many of these rations never actually made it past the beach because they either got too soaked or were just discarded or lost somehow. Or in the case of the 23,000 British and American paratroopers, the rations would often end up scattered around the French countryside. A lot of their equipment actually got kind of lost when they were dropping, and so the rations was kind of the least of the issue. As long as you had your gun, that was good. But many of the paratroopers, at least the Americans, ended up only having those D rations, the emergency chocolate bar. And so after a full day of fighting, they were really needing something else to eat. This often meant trying to get food from the locals, and one paratrooper recalled going up to a Norman farmer and trying to swap his chocolate for some fresh eggs. But he didn't speak any French, and so the farmer was probably frightened and definitely confused. So I started making noises like a chicken, and I hopped around, and he thought I wanted a whole chicken and tried to catch one. And since he didn't know the French word for egg, he decided to mime it with his hands, and finally the farmer got it, and he swapped some eggs for the American's chocolate bar. And he was not the only paratrooper who got fresh eggs that day. First Lieutenant S.H. Matheson recalled that early in the morning, a French boy in the farmhouse, about 12 years old, and his friend gathered up a cart and horses and assisted in gathering up some of our equipment bundles. I obtained a couple of eggs and scrambled them in a cup, and with a piece of French bread, had scrambled eggs and bread before the landing took place on the beach. Perhaps even more rewarding was when they got food from the enemy, from the Germans who they had just beaten back and pushed inland. Lieutenant Carl Cartledge of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment recalled driving out a number of Germans from a farmhouse, killing several in the process, only to find a dining room table inside that was laden with half-eaten food, everything from cold meats and cheese to fresh fruit like apples and cider, which I'm guessing was a much better feast than what they had in their ration packs. There were also others who had brought additional food from England with them, which of course just added to the weight of their already heavy packs, and sometimes that food didn't really make the landing so well. For example, Sergeant John Ellery of the 16th Infantry Regiment had brought some apples with him, and shortly after shooting a German sniper decided that he had earned the right to eat one. But as he dug around in his musette bag, I discovered that my apples had become applesauce. So I settled for a K ration and enjoyed it. I enjoyed it so much that I decided to have another. It seemed to me that I wasn't likely to outlast my supply of rations, so there was no point in going hungry. By evening on D-Day, once the beaches were secured, landing crafts began arriving that were essentially giant floating kitchens, and meals were prepared for many of the men, at least those who were still on or near the beaches. But some of the troops had already started to head inland, especially those who had entered Normandy via the air, like Lieutenant C.T. Cross of the British 6th Airborne Division. He had landed in Normandy via glider. And later on, he wrote to his parents, letting him know that he was okay and his experience in landing in Normandy, and then said that he headed toward the battlefield. I shall not tell you about that, except that, apart from a bar of chocolate and half the contents of my whiskey flask, I had no time to eat or drink for a very uncomfortably long while. I didn't notice it much at the time, too much else to do, but it seems incredible now. From my last meal in England to my first cup of char and hard ration in France was very nearly 48 hours. But I've been making up for it since. I had to look up what char meant, and it turns out it is another word for a cup of tea. It comes from the Chinese cha, which means tea. Also, while he is usually referred to as Lieutenant C.T. Cross, his real first name is Chris, so he was Lieutenant Chris Cross, which I think would be a cool rapper name, like back in the early 90s. Anyway, for most troops, other than the occasional meal while on leave, for the next year, they could expect little more than rations and the meals made in the field kitchens, which relied on recipes from this cookbook. Meals like the powdered eggs and bacon, which I'm about to eat after I make my lemonless lemonade. So this recipe calls for 3 ingredients: lemon juice powder, sugar, and water. Again, it makes 100 servings, so I'm going to cut it way down. So whisk together 2 tablespoons of lemon juice powder and a heaping cup or half pound of sugar, then slowly add that to a half gallon of water, stirring constantly until it is all dissolved. Then chill it so it's nice and cold when you dish up your eggs. And here we are, a breakfast of eggs, bacon, and toast, and lemonade, as might have been eaten just before the D-Day landings. So I gotta say, I'm surprised. They look and smell like eggs and bacon should smell. So let's give them a try. They don't quite taste that way though. Okay, so they're not horrible, but they're also not real eggs. You can definitely tell. And it's less the flavor and more the texture. There's just something a little off. It's kind of reminds me more of like tofu than eggs. And I think what saves the flavor is that the bacon is real. I think that if these were without any bacon, I think that they would not be great. Yeah, probably wouldn't last very long in the military. But let me try the lemonade. That's actually really good. I mean, you could tell it is not fresh lemonade. There's like an extra flavor in there. I mean, it kind of tastes like country time lemonade, but maybe more metallic? Though maybe that's the cup. So yeah, if you want to make these, this book is available online. I'll put a link in the description, as well as the World War II Navy cookbook from the US. But all of the recipes that I have done, these included, are on the Tasting History. I will see you next week on Tasting History, but not in this kitchen. This is it. This is a fond farewell. I've done over 100 episodes here. This is the last one. It'll be a few weeks before I'm back in this kitchen, probably, and it won't look like this, but stick around, because it's still Tasting History. During World War I, British troops on the Western Front had limited options when it came to food in the trenches. But with a clever cook on hand, they might be able to use their rations to make something like this potato pie made using a military recipe from 1914. So thank you to my Patreon patrons for supporting this channel as I cook for the Tommies in the trenches, this time on Tasting History. Food on the Western Front during World War I was pretty monotonous. It was pretty much a combination of bully beef and biscuits, that is, canned corned beef and hardtack. But while some complained of the monotony, many soldiers were coming from a place where they were lucky to have meat 1 or 2 times a week, so a daily ration of meat, canned or not, was actually a step up. Like when the men of Stockport's territorial soldiers joined up with the Cheshire Regiment, they thought they were eating high on the hog. You should have seen the scramble. I thought Mackinac was great, but the good old potato pie wants some beating. Just fancy potato pie being served to the Cheshires. And it turns out there is a proper military recipe for that potato pie. It comes from the field cooking section of the 1914 edition of the Manual of Military Cooking, prepared at the Army School of Cookery. Potato pie. 16.5 pounds meat, 20 pounds potatoes, 1 pound onions, 3 ounces salt, 1/2 ounce of pepper. Cut up and stew the onions with jelly from the meat added. Boil or steam the potatoes. When cooked, mash them. Line the sides of the dish with 1/3 of the mashed potatoes. Place the meat and cooked onions in the center, season with pepper and salt. Cover over the remainder of the mashed potatoes and bake till the potato cover is brown. As the mashed potatoes absorb the moisture of the meat and render it dry, about 2 pints of gravy prepared from the liquor in which the onions were cooked should be poured into the pie before serving. Now that is a mighty big pie, enough for 22 men serving in the army. So I'm going to cut this down to just 8 servings, which still should be quite a lot of pie. So for this World War I potato pie, what you'll need is 2 pounds or 925 grams of tinned corned beef. Now you may be tempted to use fresh meat for this, but the recipe is specific that it wants preserved meat. And the recipe has you use the jelly or the gelatin that is inside of the can and attached to the meat. So you really got to get that real tinned bully beef. Then 2.5 pounds or 1.1 kilograms of potatoes, 2 ounces or 55 grams of diced onions, 1.5 teaspoons of salt, 1 teaspoon of pepper, and to make the gravy you'll need 2 tablespoons of butter and 1 tablespoon of cornstarch. So the first thing you want to do is make the mashed potatoes, and it's really up to you if you want to leave the skins on or peel them. I'm going to leave the skins on because I like them and frankly it's easier. Either way, chop them into small cubes and put them in a pot and cover with water. Then bring it to a simmer and boil for about 20 minutes or until they're very soft, at which point you can drain them and mash them up. This is really the simplest, most basic mashed potato that ever was. No butter, no cream, zip. Then we can simmer the onions, and really you can do this while you're boiling the potatoes. All you do is gather up all of that gelatin that is attached to the meat and inside of the can, and add that with the onions in a small saucepan, and then pour in about 1.5 cups of water. Set that over a low heat and bring it to a simmer, and cook the onions until they're translucent. About 12 to 15 minutes should do. Then remove them from the stove and strain out the cooking liquid, but don't get rid of that because we need that to make our gravy. And now we can move on to the corned beef. This you should mash up like you would ground beef and then season it with the salt and pepper. Honestly, there is a lot of salt in corned beef, so I don't really think it needs more salt added, but the recipe says to do so, so that's what I'm doing. Then we add the onions in and mix it all up until they're well incorporated. Now, up to this point, everything that we've done could be done in pretty much any field kitchen. These were horse-drawn stoves that were typically wood-fired, though coal and oil-fired also existed, like the Loon Valley kitchen that included not only a stovetop for frying and 2 20-gallon boilers for preparing stews, but it also had 2 large ovens fitted with baking dishes. These kitchens were meant to cook enough food for 250 soldiers every single day, so let's just assume we would have access to one of those so we can go ahead and make this pie. So assemble your potato pie by taking 1/3 of the mashed potatoes and pressing them around the edges of an 8 by 8 inch baking pan. At first I thought I would put them on the bottom too, but the recipe is pretty clear that it just wants them around the edges. Then add in your corned beef and onion filling into the center and tamp it down to fill up all the corners. Then put the remaining mashed potatoes on top, spreading them over the meat just like a very basic shepherd's pie. Then pop that into the oven at 400 degrees Fahrenheit or 205 Celsius and bake until the top of the potatoes start to brown, about 35 to 40 minutes, during which time we can make our gravy. Now, there are a few recipes from the period in Army manuals on how to make gravy. This is one of the more basic versions because we're using that water that we boiled the onions in. So you take that liquid and you heat it back up on the stove, and then you add in the butter and let it melt completely, and then whisk the cornstarch into a little water to make a slurry and add that into the simmering liquid, mixing it in, and let it simmer for about 10 minutes or until it's thickened up. That should take about 10 minutes. Plenty of time to tell you that I am now uploading ad-free videos over on Patreon and here on YouTube for memberships. So I'll put links in the description to where you can find those. They're these videos, but without ads. And now I can tell you a bit more about what the British troops, the Tommies, ate in the trenches on the Western Front during World War I. So I wanted to start by recommending this book, Bully Beef and Biscuits. It is a wonderful overview of all things British food during World War I, both with the soldiers and on the home front. But today, I am just talking about feeding the soldiers, the enlisted men, because the officers ate very, very differently, on the Western Front during the war. Now, when the war broke out in August of 1914, Britain was not really prepared to actually go to war. So quickly, the government called for any young men over the age of 19 to join the army. Many of those were actually younger than 19, but they joined up provided they lied about their age, because it doesn't seem that there was a great system for actually confirming anyone's age. It was just kind of a, you're 19? Okay, sure, why not? So now you have hundreds of thousands of young men in their late teens and early 20s joining up to fight the Germans. But just as many young men today, they were not adept at feeding themselves, let alone cooking for each other. And so the army had to very quickly train some of them as cooks. There were a few army schools of cookery in England, and they quickly set up more in France and other parts of the world. But before the war broke out, there was a 4-month program to teach these people how to cook for the enlisted men and for the officers. But once the war broke out, that went from 4 months down to about 2 to 4 weeks. And most of that time was actually not spent in teaching cooking, but in teaching sanitation and how to make sure that everybody was not going to get sick. Also, at the start of the war, it was hard to get volunteers to do the cooking because it seemed like an inglorious position compared to the glorious position of charging at a German army out in the open field. But very quickly, people realized that war is not so fun, and so a lot more people wanted to become cooks after that, especially because it did come with some perks. For one thing, I was sent on a cookery course at an army cookery school in a village hall well behind the lines for a month. We were taught how to cook meat, vegetables, and the sort of puddings that could be made from the rations we got. For example, if we were lucky enough to get currants, we could make plum duff. We were also taught how to cut up quarters of beef, whole carcasses of sheep, and sides of bacon, because that's how the rations came. So you were sent off away from the fighting, a definite plus. And even when you got back from cookery school, you were placed along the supply lines, which could be several hundred yards back from the front line. So a place of relative safety. And I say relative because there are numerous stories of shells coming and blowing up the kitchens just as well, but it was safer than the front lines. Though a lot of people working in the kitchens who were not necessarily the cooks still had to go to the front lines to take the hot food up to the men who were there. So hot meals were sent up regularly and included a hot supper issued generally about midnight, the meals being mostly carried up by the support company. And these hot meals could really vary in quality depending on the ingredients that you got. Mostly it was canned foods that were being used, but once in a while you had access to something else. Like in 1915, when a private from the Cheshire Regiment of the 6th Battalion wrote that we had a stroke of luck on February 16th. A group of cattle strayed near our trenches, so we shot a young steer. We cut a leg off, and in less than 2 hours, men and officers alike were having a feed fit for a king. Fried steak, with the Germans 200 yards from us. Of course, it also depended on who was doing the cooking. Some cooks were obviously better than others. Like, I would not want to be served a meal from the cook of the 22nd Field Ambulance. One of the men of the unit wrote, "I must say we are living very well, plenty to eat. We had a jam roll for dinner the other day, and the only fault about it was the cook wrapped it in the towel that we wipe the patient's feet with. But he said he washed it well before he cooked the pudding." Of course, we could not answer for the truth of that, but anyway, it went down all right. Those little trifles don't amount to much out at the front. Even something as simple but as precious as tea could be ruined by a negligent cook. Having found the battalion cooks and their wagons, little time was lost in making tea, which all ranks had not tasted for 5 days. By the time it was ready to be served, darkness had fallen. The men with their canteen tins formed up and filed past their respective company quartermaster sergeants, who ladled out the precious liquid. Alas, in the darkness, salt instead of sugar had been put into the tea. Not great, but I'm guessing they drank it anyway. Tea was, after all, one of the most important part of the enlisted man's ration. They drank it with pretty much every meal. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, provided you were able to get 3 meals a day. But regardless of how many meals you got, you were given a set number of calories each day, in theory. And that was about 4,200 calories, though this did drop a bit as the war went on and food became scarce. The calories mostly came from a daily ration of biscuits and bully beef, plus some bacon, vegetables, which were almost always dried, then some tea, sugar, cheese, a very small amount of rum, butter, and jam. And the jam was Tickler's plum and apple, and it was actually very important not just because it satiated one's sweet tooth, but because the canisters could actually be used to make makeshift hand grenades. They were called jam jar bombs or jam tin bombs and were a specialty of the Anzacs, or Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. They were made by filling the can with shrapnel embedded in resin and then fitted with some explosive, a detonator, and a fuse, and then sealed. And it wasn't just jam pots, they also used condensed milk cans and bully beef tins, which had once held the Fray Bentos corned beef. This corned beef required no cooking and was an ideal food for those men who were in areas of the trenches where the hot meals from the kitchens just couldn't make it. It was actually rather common for men to have to cook their own rations because they were in areas that were either too dangerous or just too difficult to get the food from the kitchens to them. And so for those men, there were a few options. One was to just eat your rations cold, and that would be fine for the bully beef, not delicious, but you could eat it cold. It didn't need to be cooked, as well as the jam and the cheese, and of course, the biscuits or hardtack. There were a few companies that made these biscuits, but most famous was Huntley and Palmer's, who produced the Army Biscuit No. 4, which was a 4x4-inch square of flour, salt, and water, sometimes a little sugar, but often not, that was dried into a biscuit so hard that they needed to be broken up with a rock before eating. And even then, they couldn't be eaten dry. The Army biscuits suit me. Of course, they are too hard for my poor teeth, but hot tea and patience helps one past all. These biscuits, which were the staple of military food for the last 2,000 years in one form or another, were so hard that it was said that the goat mascot of the 5th Canadian Battalion couldn't even eat them. I've chewed on decks of cards, I've dined off nails. If this was a sardine tin, I might risk it. But this is where my goatish courage fails. I simply can't digest this HT biscuit. Really, the best way to eat these biscuits was to cook with them. Either include them in a soup to make it thicker like a stew, or to mash them up and mix them with hot water and jam, and that would make a sort of sweet porridge that you could have for breakfast. But to do that, that meant that you needed to be able to cook and have a source of fire, which was not something so easily done in the damp and muddy trenches of World War I. One option men had was to create what was known as a mess tin kitchen or mess tin stove. And this is where a group could put food in their mess tins, then stack them in a way that created a small cave of sorts. The stack would be set on a piece of metal or something else that wouldn't burn, and then a little fire could be put into that cave and it would heat the food around it. Unfortunately, it was hard to find heat sources that really lasted, so often the food was still just lukewarm at best. One way that they would create heat sometimes was to tear a bit of the burlap off of the sandbags, dip it into either lamp oil or candle wax, and then light that on fire. So it would stay on fire for a little while, but not great that you're taking apart the sandbags that are protecting you from German gunfire. So instead, the Army started supplying the men with Tommy cookers, or campite. And these were essentially mini camping stoves that came with solidified fuel, something that could be lit and burn for a good 15 or 20 minutes. They were water resistant and they wouldn't go out in windy weather. And this allowed for a single soldier to heat up their own rations in a can, whether it was a trench stew that they made themselves or one of the pre-made canned stews known as Mackinac. This could refer to most any canned stew, but it got its name from the original Mackinac Army ration, which was a stew of beef, turnips, carrots, potatoes, onions, and green beans in a broth that was once described as an inferior grade of garbage, and it was purported to give the troops flatulence of a particularly offensive nature. And it was a divisive meal, to say the least. Many soldiers said that it was next to inedible, especially when it was cold, but when you were really, really hungry, it definitely did the job. As Lance Corporal Henry Buckle wrote in his diary, "Had a glorious meal today. Got a Mackinac ration from some engineers in the wood. A round tin containing meat, spuds, carrots, beans, and gravy. Enough for 2 in a tin. This is the first time we, the poor infantry, have seen one. Had a real blowout. Must try and get another. They are the goods, believe me." It was a plain stew, but a hearty one, and a welcome change from months and months on end of nothing but bully beef and biscuits. Now, there were times when the rations or the food that the soldiers got was much more elevated, mainly at Christmas time, and I did a whole video on what the World War I soldiers were eating at Christmas, specifically foods that were sent to them from their loved ones, like they would send them boiled puddings for Christmas. Then there was the occasional bar of chocolate. In 1914, the city of York sent a nice-sized tin of chocolate to all of the soldiers from the York area. And a gunner, Henry Bailey, was so grateful that he felt it necessary to write the city a thank you note. I feel that I ought to send my very best thanks for the nice box of chocolate I received so unexpectedly. I am proud to be able to say that I am a York lad, and am looking forward to a speedy termination of this cruel war. I shall prize the box as long as God spares me. I wish I could do that in a York accent. I love the accent in and around York. It's absolutely wonderful. Anyway, Christmas puddings and chocolate, while wonderful, were definitely not the daily fare. Typically, if you wanted to get something other than your usual ration, you had to depend on a scrounger, and this was the name of a person in your unit who was good at scrounging around and getting extra things, whether that was a bit of extra fresh meat or tea or alcohol, sugar, anything really. But the term scrounger is just a really nice way of saying a thief, because that's what they were. Now, there was one more ration that all of the soldiers carried with them, but was pretty much never opened, and that was the iron ration. And that was meant to only be eaten in case of an emergency. This typically included about 12 ounces of biscuits, a pound of corned beef, 2 ounces of sugar, and 5/8 of an ounce of tea, or enough for a few cups. And as it was meant to be used for emergencies only, there were periodic checks to make sure that each man had his, and printed on the box were the words, "Not to be opened unless instructed by an officer." Fortunately for me, there is no officer around to order me to open up my iron ration and eat that, so instead I get to eat something slightly fancier, and that would be my preserved meat potato pie. So once the potatoes have browned a little on top, remove the pie from the oven and serve it up, pouring a bit of the gravy on top. And here we are, potato pie from the trenches of the Great War. I have to say, it doesn't smell that horrible, kind of like just corned beef, really. But let's see how it tastes. Here we go. That's very salty. You don't need to add salt. I wish it had more onions. There are just so few onions. Could use more onions, but the flavor ain't half bad. It's just that the canned corned beef is so salty, really doesn't need to have more added. And old canned corned beef was actually usually even more salty. That's where the name corned beef comes from. It has nothing to do with corn, like an ear of corn. It's that they would use big kernels of salt and pack it in that to give it the salty texture or salty flavor and preserve it. And those corns of salt became corned beef. That is actually where we get the word corn, because a piece of a kernel of corn, kernel of wheat, all of those, it's all corn. Anyway, something that many, many troops had access to was this. Not this modern bottle, but it hasn't really changed much, and that is HP sauce. It was very common during World War I with the British Army. They would put it on absolutely everything. So I'm going to try a little bit of that. Just put a dab on there. Here we go. Yeah, it makes it much, much better. That's actually delicious now. I love HP sauce. I don't know how to explain it. It's a brown sauce. It's not ketchup, but it's kind of sweet like ketchup, but it's also, there's like a zing to it because it has malt vinegar in it. It's just delicious. It's still really, really popular in Britain. And I wish it was more popular here because it's absolutely good. So make this. It's worth making. Just trying it out, and if nothing else, it'll make you grateful that you are not a Tommy in the trenches during World War I. And I will see you next time on Tasting History.